mental skills.
I have heard from many parents that they've been absolutely shocked and hurt when they're at some point a child or both of their children, if they have more than their children, say, I really don't want you to come and be at my school, or I'd really rather you didn't. I don't really want my friends to meet you. And sometimes that doesn't really come up until kids are older. But one of the kids one of the stories I read, and I know this came up a bit in your book, but I read something more recent on a web page that a mother was struggling because her 11-year-old son said something like, I don't want my friends to meet you because you're so masculine. There was an issue around the sort of how his mother's gender expression would be perceived, and my sense is that when children start to get into adolescence and they have their own sort of awareness of sexuality and gender, and the name calling around that stuff gets really intense, that's maybe where there's some dissonance around their comfort level and their comfort being kind of associated with a gay family.
It's difficult to separate a lot of times what has to do with having gay parents and what has to do with being a teenager. So sometimes it's hard for parents to be able to discern that. An example being if a son of lesbian mom says, I don't want you kissing me anymore when you drop me off at school. A lesbian mom might internalize that and say he's ashamed of having a lesbian mom, or she might realize he's turning 11 or 12 and that's no longer something that he wants to do, and that's a developmental thing. So you have that piece of it. But the other thing is figuring out those boundaries for yourself as you're growing up. And I think it's really important for parents to be able to, what I call the crushed parent look, to be able to hide that the look of this is really hurting me. Because once kids see that, then they try to protect their parents from everything else they're experiencing, and it closes down that communication. And so it's important for parents when their kid says, I don't want my friends coming over. I understand that that's how you feel about it now. We'll talk about this next winter. We'll talk about this when school's out. We'll check in about this again, so that the child knows that the door is open. They don't have to stay stubborn and say that this is how it's going to be forever, but that it's a temporary situation and not a reflection on the gender expression or identity politics of their parents.
You spoke in Minnesota recently at the Rainbow Families Conference, and I know that's sort of your home base. You talked about how our children fit into the LGBT community, and how what language we use, and how we define you, and how you define yourselves. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways in which our children, especially your generation, feel sometimes alienated and marginalized from this community. Yet you have a very different, visceral kind of an emotional connection to the community.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to identify any heterosexual who's supportive of LGBT issues as an ally. And this is what happens to so many of these children, is that now we've spent 2 decades producing research that says that children of LGBT parents are no more likely to turn out to be LGBT themselves. And we've had to do that to satisfy homophobic court systems, because that was in order to get gay and lesbian people to keep custody of their children in cases of divorce after coming out. That message is that the children are going to be straight. There's pride in that, which is inherently homophobic. I hear it touted all the time. Yet where are those straight children? And for me, growing up, now as I'm an adult, there's so few of us that are actually involved in the LGBT community, much because we are often labeled as outsiders. So we grow up culturally queer. We grow up within the LGBT community on the front lines, because there's a family tree project in kindergarten, that we are finding those words, and we are de facto educators and ambassadors every day. Yet we turn 18, leave the house, go off into the world, and because we're straight, we're suddenly labeled allies. Allies are important, But for us as children of these families, we don't identify as allies. That puts us on the outside of a community that we're a part of. And for us to go into the straight world, where we are translating things, we are outsiders to that world, and we're viewed as that too. We are viewed as the people who are different, the people who have weird values, yet within our own community we're considered outsiders as well. So it's that caught between two worlds experience that really makes me advocate for thinking into the long-term future. I know it's very difficult for parents with a 6-month-old to start contemplating her future identity politics. But that's what we need to do, is say, what do we want the LGBT community to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now when we have millions of culturally queer, erotically straight children in our own community?
I love those terms. I remember listening to NPR a couple years ago, and the reporter had attended the Provincetown Family Week, and she was interviewing a teenager who used that exact term. He said, "I'm straight, but I'm culturally queer." And I thought, wow, our kids they're really living in two worlds, or sometimes more than two worlds. I mean, depends on their cultural and ethnic identity, and whether they're adopted and have other sort of layers. But being culturally queer, I had thought about that. You don't just turn 18 and you're done. It's always a part of who you are. I mean, you probably know more about Judy Garland than the average 34-year-old straight woman.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that the experience of giving people that language, offering culturally queer to other sons and daughters that have LGBT parents, their reaction is exactly what mine was, which was relief. That I was not the freak that I thought I was, and that language meant that this was enough of a phenomenon that someone had taken the time to put words to it. And that validated my existence. And no longer did I feel like I was whining in some kind of cultural exile, or some kind of, I should say, emotional exile, but I knew that was my way of putting words to homesickness as an adult.
Well, I know that you made a proclamation recently that you are retiring, and I was very envious at 34 you're retiring, but then I listened to the rest of the sentence. Right. Retiring from being a spokesperson, or at least primarily in that role as spokesperson for adults who grew up with gay and lesbian parents. And I just wondered if you can say a little bit about how you came to that decision, what your hope is for the next leaders to come, and what you plan to do next.
My mission since the very beginning has been to bring voice to the experience of people who have LGBT parents and to decrease their invisibility. And I have spent 12 years doing that. I think that it's really important if my mission is to increase those voices, is to get out of the way, to make sure that there's space for more people. I interviewed over 50 sons and daughters in my book, Families Like Mine, and I know dozens others. But sometimes I think there's a sense that this is my territory, and I never want any movement to be too closely connected to any one person, because that will limit it. And I know that there are going to be younger people coming up through the advocacy ranks, if that's how they choose to be present and involved in the LGBT community. And I know they're going to have ideas that I don't agree with, and I know there are going to be things that I'm uncomfortable with, and I want to make sure that they have those opportunities to experiment with new ideas. And I've written my stuff down. I calculated that between my blog and my book and my columns, I've written over 500,000 words for gay families, and I look forward to seeing the new energy that comes forward.
Well, thank you for your contribution. I know for me this has been a really terrific gift, and it came at a very critical time, and I always highly recommend to parents to read this book, not to wait until your kids are 7 or 11 or 15, but to integrate some of these concepts and some of this broader thinking about the responsibility we're taking on as LGBT parents. So thank you for this, and good luck with your future endeavors.
Thank you, Ellen.